Hi everyone, thank you for taking the time to tune into this presentation today. My name is Jody McLaughlin. I'm a Senior Technical Support Engineer for Informatica Global Customer Support. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a demo on how to enable SSL for Enterprise Data Catalog 10.5. So as part of this presentation, I just want to take you through a couple of high-level points in terms of what we will cover. The first of these being that the main topic of this demonstration is to essentially guide you through the process of generating custom SSL certificates for use with the Informatica cluster service in EDC 10.5. We will be signing those certificates by an external CA authority, and we will demonstrate that through the use of Microsoft Certificate Authority services as part of this demo. So the demo is going to be done on EDC 10.5 Service Pack 1, just to make you aware that steps are applicable to later releases, but they are also subject to change. So typically Informatica, we would advise that you upgrade to the latest available hotfix or service pack in the 10.5 installation, just to ensure you avail of any product bug fixes and or new features that have been released. So as I kind of mentioned there previously, the demo, we will also be using Microsoft Certificate Authority services that will act as our external certificate authority, just for the purposes of demonstrating the signing of our certificates. And we've built a couple of custom templates in order to sign the certificates with the correct attributes to be used with the Informatica cluster service. And I will go through these also as part of the demo. And in the next slide, we'll cover off these in terms of the requirements for the cluster. Lastly, there on the slide, you can see is just a brief outline in terms of the environment that's going to be used for this demo as well, and also the role of each of the hosts involved. So the domain host, that's going to have the Informatica domain, and it's also going to be used for running the catalog service. The gateway host is also a host in the cluster hosts that are going to be used. So there's 3 there in total that will be basically running all the services of the cluster. So coming to the certificate requirements, it's important to ensure that these requirements are met by your certificate authority when they actually sign the certificates for use with the Informatica cluster service. If the requirements have not been met, you will likely encounter issues along the way in getting set up. So we'd strongly advise that you stick to this table that shows the list of requirements to ensure that the deployment of EDC is as seamless as possible. So the first of the requirements there is that you must use a single CA authority for both the cluster and client certificates. And if you look at the table here, you'll see on the far left column, each prerequisite is listed as a requirement. The second column will show whether that prerequisite is a cluster certificate requirement. And the third column across will also show if it's a client certificate requirement. There are variations between the two, and so it's important to note the differences as well. So coming to the second requirement, you'll see there that the attributes for the cluster certificate, you must have digital signature and key encipherment set up as part of the key usage on the cluster certificate, and you must also ensure that server authentication and client authentication is provided for the extended key usage on the cluster certificate. On the other hand, for the client certificate, we only require that the digital signature be there for the key usage, and client authentication is there for the extended key usage. Again, these are things that I'll cover later in the demo, just showing them through the Microsoft certificate services, and the templates that we've set up have these particular attributes configured. Moving on to the third requirement, then you must ensure that the certificate for both the cluster certificate and the client certificate, they both have a distinguished name and that it is the same. If there's any differences in the distinguished name from the client and cluster certificate, it'll cause problems with the cluster. So it must be the same across both the client and cluster certificate. On the other hand, we also have a requirement that the organizational unit be specified on the signed certificate that comes back, but the value for the organizational unit must be different between the cluster certificate and the client certificate for the purpose of MongoDB authentication. So that is another aspect that needs to be considered. If if the distinguished name is the same, and also the organizational unit is the same, then the services in the cluster will fail to start up based on the organizational unit being the same. If the organizational unit is different, which is what is expected, but the distinguished name between the client and cluster certificate is also different, then you also encounter failures. So it's important to ensure that the distinguished name between the two certificates are the same, and that the organizational unit between the two certificates is different. Moving on to the fourth point here, the fourth requirement. As part of this demo, we're going to be using a custom common name with the domain name informatica.com. This particular requirement is just outlining that there is typically a default convention that is used by the cluster service when reading the distinguished name and common name on the certificate. So you can see there the format is typically constructed of the Informatica domain name, followed by a dash separator, then the cluster service name, followed by a point separator, and then the actual DNS domain name itself, such as informatica.com. As part of this demo, as I said, we're going to use a custom common name in the form of informatica.com, and it's going to be the same across both cluster and client certificate. I will show that as well at a later stage. Moving on to the fifth requirement, then for the SAN, or the subject alternative name, for the cluster certificate, this will only contain the fully qualified domain name of each of the cluster nodes. So I have 3 nodes in total, and I'm going to be providing the fully qualified domain name for each of those hosts on the SAN on the cluster certificates. On the other hand, for the client certificate, I'm going to be providing the fully qualified domain name of the host that is going to be running the catalog service, which will be my Informatica domain machine, and also the 3 cluster nodes, the fully qualified domain name for each of the 3 cluster nodes. So in total for the client certificate, I'm going to have 4 hosts specified on the SAN. And then the last 2 points, validate the generated certificate signing request. This is more of an optional command that you can use if you want to validate the certificate signing requests that are outputted from the utility. Whereas the very last point there, which is verify the signed certificate is in PEM format, we would strongly advise that the files that you get back from your certificate authority that are signed are in PEM format or converted to a PEM format, so that the utility can then be used to further import those certificates into the required key stores to then deploy the service, the cluster service with correct certificates. So that covers the certificate requirements. Just before we get finally stuck into the demo, I'm just going to cover off a couple of points in terms of assumptions that we'll make, because not all customers will be approaching the SSL deployment from a brand new installation. They might be working with, for example, a installation of EDC that's already been installed and is up and running in non-TLS mode. In that case, the approach would be slightly different to the approach we're taking here. We're coming at this from this demonstration. We're coming at it from the basis where TLS is already enabled on the domain. That is a prerequisite which must be met as part of deploying SSL for the EDC cluster service and catalog service. So if you've not already done that, we would strongly advise you check out our KB. There's knowledge articles out there which will help you with enabling TLS for the domain. But if you're already having an existing install, you will need to take a backup of the existing data in the cluster service and then clean down the cluster before actually implementing your SSL changes. So as part of this demo, we're going to be covering the scenario where the EDC install is brand new. We will be creating the cluster service from scratch. The domain we are using is already TLS enabled. And this is kind of our way of just kind of demonstrating the process of deploying SSL from scratch. So you'll also see in the middle of the screen that there is a link to our Hotfix Downloads website that will include a SSL scripts utility, which we would strongly recommend you download as part of this demonstration as well. That is what we will be using when we're generating the files. And the last 2 points that are on this slide are also just to point out that you should ensure any of the machines that you're using as part of the EDC install contain the correct entry for each host in the format of the fully qualified domain name. So the host name followed by the actual domain name itself. And that whenever you specify the host names on the cluster service, they are in the form of the fully qualified domain name. In other words, you're not using any short aliases or short names for the hosts. Okay, so that covers the assumptions as part of before starting the demo. So now at this point, we're going to transition over to performing the demo itself and get stuck in. Okay, so I've now transitioned the screen to a PODI session. This machine that I'm logged into is my Informatica domain host. And it's the same host that I'm going to be running the catalog service from, as well as it's the host where I'm going to actually generate the SSL files. So what I want to point out at this point in time is that I have a directory created called key stores. And inside of that, I have my own InfoKey store and InfoTrust store files that are used for my Informatica domains. The domain node is already TLS enabled and is using these set of files for the purposes of SSL. The SSL utility that I had referred to earlier in the presentation is also been downloaded, and it's this zip file here shown on my screen, highlighted in red. I have gotten that from the Hotfix Downloads website, which I can show you here on my screen. So if you go to the Hotfix Downloads website and Informatica Network, if you go under Enterprise Data Catalog 10.5.x, if you click on All OS and scroll down, you will see a installation file called Custom SSL Scripts Utility Installer. Once you click here to download the Hotfix installer, you'll be prompted to put a username and password in. So the username is Hotfix and the password is Hotfix1! So once that is downloaded, if you can FTP that onto the same onto the same host as you're going to run the catalog service and set up the SSL files, I would suggest placing it into the same folder as the key store and trust store files that's used by your Informatica node, which is configured in TLS mode. The reason being is because when we start the cluster service for the first time, it will look in the same directory that the custom key store trust store is configured for the Informatica node, and then it will look for a directory named after the cluster service. So in this directory, we will have a directory called Informatica cluster service, which is going to be the name I'm just going to use by default for our cluster service. But when the cluster service starts up to begin with to deploy the SSL files, it will look for this directory in under key stores. So it's important to place the files correctly, otherwise it won't source the files correctly and the service will fail. So to get stuck in here, what the first thing we need to do is just unzip basically the custom SSL scripts util zip file, and once you inflate that, you'll get a custom SSL scripts directory. Inside of that, there will be 4 files: generate csr.sh, generate certs.sh, and 2 property files, one property file for the CSR and another property file for the certs. So pretty much generate underscore csr.sh goes hand in hand with the gen underscore csr.properties file. which will populate, and the generate underscore search.sh goes hand in hand with the gen underscore search.properties file. So the first set of scripts, or the first script that we'll be running, is to generate certificate signing requests, and then following that, once we get the signed certificates back, we'll be using the generate certs sh script to import the signed files, essentially. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to my admin console for EDC. And I'm going to start by creating our cluster service. And then based on that, after we've created the cluster service, we can then go ahead and set up the properties files to match. So I'm now logged in. I'm going to go to my services and nodes page. And what I will do is I'll click on the domain navigator. Under the domain navigator, I'll click on the domain name, and I'll click Actions, New, Informatica Cluster Service. And as I said, I'm going to call this Informatica Cluster Service. And license, I'm just going to select default license and the node in which I'm going to run the cluster service from. So from here, I'm then prompted, do I want to specify a HTTP port, or if I want to enable TLS? As I want to enable TLS, in this case, I'm going to select the checkbox for enable transport layer security. I always tend to use the same default port for the HTTP, so I'm just going to put in here again 9075, as I know it's a port that's not currently used and I can use it. And then the next thing I'm going to input is the key store file, which in my case is going to be the key store file that is in the directory, which I showed on my PuTTY session, which is used by my my Informatica domain node for TLS. So it's under this directory here, keystores info underscore keystore.jks. And double check that. Home, yep, looks good. And then I'm going to put in the password as well for my key store file. And I'm just going to use the default password here and click next. Now we get to the section of the gateway host. So it doesn't really matter which particular host machine you're going to be using here, in this case gateway, but as long as you specify one of the host machines that you'd like to use for the gateway, that's perfectly fine. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation as well, please ensure that you use the fully qualified domain name for each host machine that you're specifying here as data nodes and the processing nodes. So I've just copied the same values down across the domain nodes as the processing nodes, and I'm going to give my gateway user here as well. I'm going to leave the cluster custom directory as the same as it is and leave all the other settings fine. For now, I'm not going to enable the service. I'm just going to click next and click finish to create the service. Okay, so now that's been completed and done, I'm going to go back to my my domain node again, and I'm going to modify the files for the going to modify the files for the gen underscore csr dot properties file. So I'm going to do vim on that file and hit enter. So you'll see there's quite a lot of properties here that we have to fill out as part of the process of creating the initial certificate signing requests. So I'm just going to go through each of these one by one. So the first one is the info domain key store password. So I'm going to paste that into my file, into my gen.properties, underscore csr properties file. And the server host, then this is the fully qualified domain names of the actual cluster hosts. So less the this domain node. So in this case, it's just going to be the same hosts that we've actually specified here on the cluster service. So I'm just going to copy that out, paste that in. Oops, make sure it's actually properly escaped as well. So delete that back and ensure that they are comma separated as well. Client hosts, it's again, it's going to be the same list, but it's going to also include the domain node that's used to run the catalog service. The info domain name is just going to be my domain. You can get that from the administrator console as well. Just here, it'll be called, in my case, it's just called domain. The next thing is the cluster service name. So we called it Informatica Cluster Service. Okay. And the keys output directory. So this is going to be the directory in which my info key store files actually reside, the custom key store files that I'm using. So in my case, it is this directory, same directory that I've specified in the processes tab, up to as far as key stores. So I'm just going to paste that in and make sure it's correct. Yep. And the same for the certificates output directory. I'm going to use the same location. Now the DNS name, as I mentioned earlier, when you specify the actual cluster service name, what happens is it'll create the directory under this particular keys output directory and the certs output directory. So I advise that you give the correct cluster service name, because when you start the cluster service for the first time, it'll look in this directory for a folder called Informatica Cluster Service. If it can't find it, the cluster service will just fail. So it's important to recognize that. So again, moving on, for the DNS domain, in my case, it's just going to be informatica.com. You can specify whichever is correct for your particular DNS name. Now, it's the organizational unit name. This is something that we specified earlier must be different between the client and the cluster. So in this case, what we're doing it for is the cluster cert. So I'm just going to say Informatica cluster. And if I scroll further down, we have the main cert organization unit. That's the one for the actual client. So in this case, I'm going to say Informatica client, just to make sure that they're separate, they're different values from one another. Otherwise, it will fail to start the service. So now that the organization unit is specified differently, you have to give in the organization. This is fine. I'm just going to give Informatica LLC. I'm just going to say Ireland is the location. And I'll just put in Dublin as state, and IE is the country code. And then I have to populate the organization again for the client certificate. So I'm going to say Informatica LLC again. And again, put in Ireland. And put in Dublin. And IE. The last value that's in this file, as I said, is from the presentation, is the distinguished name, the common name entry on the certificate that's generated. So we're not using the default domain name followed by cluster name followed by the DNS name. I'm just going to use a custom specified CN, so it's going to be informatica.com in my case. So once that's done, I'm just going to save the properties file, the gen_csr.properties file, and I'm going to run the generate_csr.sh script with the gen_csr properties file. Now, before I do that, all the files will need to be in executable mode. So I'm just going to chmod them, chmod 755 star, so that they become executable. And then I'm going to run this generate CSR with the properties file. Properties. So this will run down through a series of steps to create key store files for both the client and the cluster, and it'll produce that Informatica cluster service directory as I was referring to before. So if I go back a couple of directories, go back, gone too far. Oh, daisies. So you'll see here we have now this Informatica cluster service directory. So if I look in under this, I have two directories. One is the cluster certs and one is the client certs. If I look inside the cluster certs, we have keystore.jks, infonode, cert.csr, and private key in a key format and PEM format. Looking at the client certs, there will be two, or nearly twice as many. One will be for the client cert, essentially the node cert.csr, and then you have the browser cert. So whenever we try to access the likes of Nomad UI or the likes of Mongo UI, we will tend to have we'll tend to have certificates separate for that, so users can actually interact with those UIs if it's actually needed to do some debugging and troubleshooting and whatnot. So it's useful to get, essentially we'll have three CSRs, the browser cert.csr, the infonode cert.csr, and for the cluster we'll also have the infonode cert.csr. So these three need to be signed and a certificate given back for each of them for import. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the process of signing these certificates using Microsoft certificate services. So I'm going to create a directory here called signed certs. So I have three directories. I'm going to copy my signed certificates that I got back from my C authority and put them into this directory, which I'll then use as part of the I'll use as a folder to source the signed certificate files with the generate certs shell script, basically. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to cat the infonode cert.csr from the client certs directory. So this is going to be my first certificate signing request that I'm going to get signed. And so what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to jump over to my certificate services machine and just go down through the templates that we've created with the attributes that are expected on the signed certificates. Okay, so you will see on my screen, this is the certificate authority that I'll be using for creating the signed certificates. In here, I have a cluster template and a client template. So if I right click and go manage, and I'm going to open the client template first. If I go to the extensions tab, you'll see here under application properties, I have client authentication for the client template, which is what is expected. For the key usage, I have digital signature, which is the only thing that we require as part of the client certificates. When we take the cluster template, in contrast to that, for the extensions, you'll see we have both client authentication and server authentication, which is mandatory. And for the key usage, we also have digital signature, but we also have the key encipherment as well. So that's been selected. So these two templates have been published and are going to be used interchangeably when signing the certificates according to which CSR we push through. So I'm going to log on to the web page of my certificate signing service and submit the CSR requests for signing. So here I'm going to select request certificate, advanced certificate request, going to select the client template first, since this is our CSR for our client, and I'm going to select begin from the very beginning of the begin new certificate request down to the very end of the certificate request, and copy that, paste it in here into my request. I've got my web server client template selected, and for the attributes, this is where we need to specify the SAN, essentially, which is going to be listed on the certificate. So at this point, I'm going to copy the value that I need for this. Okay, so, and I will update these accordingly. So for the client, it's going to be SAN is equal to DNS. It's informatica.com. That's the first one. DNS. I'm going to update these accordingly. So EMEDC IHS01. It's one of the cluster nodes. 03. That's another of the cluster nodes. HTW01. .informatica.com. That's another one. And put in the glx73.informatica.com. That is the host that's going to be running the catalog service. So that's our SAN specified. And I'm going to click submit. Now it's giving me an option to actually download the certificate chain. So what I'm going to do here is click download certificate chain. It's giving me a bundled file. So what I'm going to do is rename that as client signed. Client signed. Okay, and I click back. And this time I'm going to check out the catalog, the Informatica node that's also going to be running the catalog service, and I'm going to specify, oh no, sorry. I will keep that in, and instead I will do the browser CSR as well. Search CSR, and I'll copy that out. Paste that in here instead, and click. We use the same template for the browser certificate as the client certificate. So click submit, download that one. See if that one is browser signed. Okay, done. Go back. Now we're going to do the cluster itself. So from here, I'm going to go to cat, and I'm going to do cluster certs. This is our cluster CSR request. So I'm going to paste that one now in here. Again, it's a 3-node cluster, so I only need the cluster nodes listed in the SAN. So I'm taking out the catalog service node. Click submit, download certificate chain, and in that cluster signed. Last one is, oops, shouldn't have done that. CA chain bundle. I'm gonna download that again. If you go to as part of the import of the certificate files into the key stores, we also have a option to specify a CA chain or a bundle, CA chain bundle, which would be specified in the properties file. So here what I'm doing is I'm downloading that chain, that certificate chain for the CA as well. So download CA certificate chain here. I'll call it CA-bundle. bundle dash chain. Once you've done that, the next step is just to transfer those files across to the signed search directory that we created. I'm going to go informatic cluster service, signed certs, and refresh my screen and copy across the 4 files that I've just created. Okay, so now if I do an ls-lrt and I go into signed certs, do a list again there, we now have the four files which have all been signed essentially. So at this point, the files are created in a format called P7B, and as I mentioned before, we would be expecting the files in PEM format as part of the import using the SSL utility. So I've got a couple of commands that I'm just going to run, which are OpenSSL commands, which will convert those files straight to PEM files. So I'm going to run this one, cluster signed, client signed, and browser signed, and the CA chain bundle. Oh, I think I've CA bundle chain. So I'm going to rename this just to be consistent with the command CA chain bundle. And rerun that again. Okay, so now I should have 8 files in total. So the 4 P7B files, and now all the rest are in the expected PEM format. So I'm just going to get rid of the P7B files for consistency's sake, and to keep it clean. So now I have the 4 PEM files essentially that I need as part of importing the signed certificates. So I'm going to go back to the directory that I had the utility. And this time I'm going to edit the gen certs properties file. So again, we have to fill the properties in for this particular file. Some of them we've already done as part of the earlier properties file for generating the certificate signing requests. So I'm just going to. Okay, next I'm just going to add in my domain trust store password. And the next step, we have to provide the path to the cluster certificate that is signed. So I'm going to just add that into the property for the cluster certificate. And it's going to be the signed certs directory. And I'm going to give cluster signed.pem, as that is for the cluster certificate. And I'm just going to do a quick ls to verify that that is the correct path to that file. Okay, that's correct. Next step, I have to copy it down for both the client certificate as well as the browser certificate. So I'm going to update this to client signed.pem. And again, paste down below for the browser certificate and do browser signed.pem. Next, we have to give the cluster service name again. So Informatica cluster service. And the next property is it's a flag control whether or not we're providing either a single PEM file for the CA certificate chain, or it's going to be separate files for the CA certificate chain. In this case, we're using one single file. So I'm just going to give the value true. And the path to my single CA certificate chain is going to be the same as the other PEM files. And it's going to be called CA chain-bundle.pem. So I'm going to validate this path as well, just to make sure it's correct, which it is. And as I said, if you're using multiple certificates or individual certificates in the form of a root intermediate certificate for your CA authority, you can set this value to false and provide the individual certificates in the following format where they're comma separated between each of the individual certificate files or PEM files. So then the last two set of properties that we have to put in is the key output directory and the certs output directory, similar to what we did for the CSR properties file. So this is just going to be the path up to as far as the directory that is containing the Informatica cluster service directory, or the name of your cluster service. So in that case, for me, it's just this path here. We just save the file, and the last thing we need to do is then run the generate cert scripts with the generate certs properties file. So now everything's been imported successfully, the browser certificates imported successfully, client certificates imported successfully, and the cluster certificates have imported successfully. So if I go back to that directory that I had before, and I go into the Informatica cluster service directory, and if I go into the likes of the cluster certs directory, you're going to find that I now have my trust store and a key store file and a lot of other, the likes of the node cert PEM files, etc. So that is essentially the process of configuring the SSL files on the domain node. At this point, we would continue with starting up the cluster service and have it deploy all the services required. So I'm just going to click enable at this point to start the service and keep an eye on it and the log from the machine, the EDC machine. So at this point, once the service is started, it could take anything up to 10 minutes to possibly half an hour for the service to get deployed. And so you may wish to fast forward this part of the recording if you're going through the setup yourself. And once the service is up and running, we'll then create our catalog service and start it also. Okay, so now that the cluster is actually finalized creating the contents and the solar shards and everything have been created, if we go back into the administrator console, you should see that the cluster service is actually now available. So it's been deployed with SSL. So the next step is then to create the catalog service, which will run on top of the cluster service. So I'm just going to call this Informatica catalog service. Again, select the license, specify the node. For the model repository service, we'll select that and put in the username and password. And we will also configure as well. I'm going to configure the same port that was used for HTTP as I'm going to use for HTTPS for TLS. And again, specify your key store that you're going to use with the catalog service. So once that's been done, you select the cluster service that you're going to run the catalog service on top of. And for now, I'm going to disable DAA, and I'm just going to start the service with the default settings. And we will check the catalog service log. Informatica catalog service. LDM.log. Which might take a little bit of time to get created. Okay. Change it to that directory. It's still taking a little bit of time to get created. Okay, so at this point, the catalog service should have started and should be up and functioning. Might take a little bit of time for the URL links become available to be able to access the UI. But at this point, EDC has been configured with the custom SSL certificates, and the service appears to have gotten to the point where the web apps have actually started and the links are now showing and available. So you should be able to log in and you should see that the connection does come back as secure and is valid. So that pretty much concludes the demo just in terms of configuring the cluster service and the catalog service with SSL. And so the last set of slides are just a summary in terms of some KB articles which you can use for enabling TLS on the domain. So as I mentioned earlier, that is a prerequisite and it should be in place before you continue to deploy SSL. You can also check out our documentation website, which has guides that go through the step-by-step instructions similar to this demo on how to configure custom SSL certificates. And if there are any issues you do encounter as you go through the process, any errors, feel free to log cases with our global customer support team and we will be happy to pick up and assist where possible. So other than that, we would love to hear from you. So if you do have any feedback with respect to the demo today, please drop us an email at the email address provided below, and also you can tweet to us on our Twitter channel as well. And finally, thank you and have a nice day.